Module summary: creating accounting setups. By the end of this module, you will be able to understand the following topics. We're going to start by understanding the accounting setup process at a summary level, and then what are all the prerequisites then you got to take as a part of the accounting setup. Then I'm going to quickly take you through the accounting setup manager pages, and finally we'll understand the exhaustive checklist for setting up your accounting in Oracle General Ledger Functional Foundation module. Alright, so let's get started with the first topic of understanding the setup process of accounting at a summary level. Accounting setup process. The accounting setup process consists of three major steps. So let's discuss them one by one. The first step is you've got to start by creating a accounting setup structure, and this in itself consists of a number of sub steps, which include you've got to create and assign a legal entity, you've got to specify the ledger attributes of the primary ledger, assuming that you've already created the ledger. Then you've got to specify the ledger attribute for one or more secondary ledgers, which is an optional setup, assuming that if you have created the secondary ledger. And lastly, you've got to assign the reporting currencies, again assuming that if at all you have created a separate reporting currencies ledger. So that would constitute the first step, which is over here. The second step is a bit of a detail, which is in relation to updating the accounting options. So once you have created the ledger, then you can go inside that ledger and update the accounting options related to that ledger, which is where this first step comes into picture. Then the next step is you complete the reporting currencies options, assuming that you've got a reporting currencies ledger setup. Then you assign the balancing segment values to legal entities. So you have set up the ledger. So as a part of setting up the ledger, you also set up the chart of accounts, and within the chart of accounts you make a segment and declare it using flex field qualifier to state that it's a balancing segment. And that's the balancing segment which identifies the legal entity as a part of your ledger setup. So you kind of tie up the balancing segment to legal entity and ledger, so that when accounting transaction happens, it can easily tie up at the legal entity level and the ledger associated for that legal entity as the primary ledger. Then you assign balancing segment values to ledger, which is pretty much similar concept. And lastly, you define subledger accounting options. So that would constitute the second step of defining the accounting options. Lastly, you complete the accounting setup, which includes define and assign operating units to the primary ledger. So assuming that you have set up your primary ledger, your legal entities, and optionally the secondary ledgers and reporting currencies ledger, then you should go to the next level of setup, which is creating and assigning the operating unit. So as a part of the operating unit setup, you assign the legal entities and the primary ledger to that operating unit. Then you define the intercompany accounts. So the intercompany accounts are at a number of different levels, at the ledger level, at the operating unit level. So within operating unit you define inventory organization, and within that inventory organization you define the intercompany accounts, and that's where you also can optionally define the intercompany balancing rules. Intercompany balancing rules can as well be defined at the ledger level, and then once that gets over, then you go and define the sequencing option. So here the sequencing is referred to the sequencing for the journal sequencing, as well as the journals coming from the subledgers such as receivables, payables, or fixed assets, and so on. Lastly, if at all you have set up any secondary ledgers, then you complete the secondary ledgers setup steps, and that would constitute your accounting setup. So you finish off with your accounting setup. It sounds easy, but it's not. It involves a lot of things inside setting up this, plus it also includes a good amount of planning from the finance folks. So you've got to work closely with the finance super user to have this setup up and running in your newly created instance. So I'm going to take you to a demonstration instance. So here we're going to go to our browser, and here I'm going to open a new one, and we'll go to the home page, and I'm going to log in as the demo user operations with a password of welcome. The other thing is, if you are new to Oracle Financials, then it's a good idea that you have a Vision demonstration instance up and running so that you can play around with that demonstration instance to understand the setup better. And then once you feel comfortable, that's where you go ahead and set up your own instance. Now navigate to the responsibility general ledger Vision operations USA. So scroll down, and that's where you are. And then navigate to setup, then financials, then accounting setup manager, and finally accounting setup. So that's going to open a HTML based form, and as you could see, that's the accounting setup steps that we discussed. So in terms of the ledger, you can either start creating a new ledger right from here, or if at all you have already created one, just like here, you can hit on update accounting options. And what I have discussed was a summary of the steps which are shown over here. So which includes the ledger options related to your primary set ledger. So here is the primary ledger, and the ledger options are over here. So when you click on this one, you can go ahead and look at all the associated primary ledger options. Okay, so that's what it is. If you click here, so these are the ledger options, and you've got advanced options over here. So assuming that you have done that, then you come out of this, and then you optionally set up the reporting currencies and any other secondary ledgers you have set up will be visible over here. Then the intercompany accounting related setup are done in these two steps. As far as the ledger is concerned, the operating unit can be defined over here, or you can define it via the inventory responsibility that I have shown you earlier in my previous modules. Okay, so you can add it straight away from here. And what else? Lastly, you've got the accounting sequencing, which is in relation to sequencing of journals and reporting. So you can define your sequence context on here, but the actual definition of sequence and assignment of those sequence are done in separate forms. Fine. And then as you could see, these are the steps in relation to the secondary ledger, which are pretty much similar to your primary ledger. So that constitutes your accounting setup process. Accounting setup prerequisites. In order to complete the accounting setup, you've got to complete a number of prerequisite setup steps. A number of these setups I have discussed previously, but let's quickly have a discussion since we are going to move shortly to hands-on accounting setups. So you've got to basically start by completing the general ledger prerequisite setups, such as defining your chart of accounts and accounting calendar. So defining of chart of account includes what you've got to define the chart of account structure. Once you have defined the structure, which includes defining the segments, associating the value sets, and then populating the value set values. Then accounting calendar will depend on your reporting requirements. It could be from Jan to December or from April to March. It's more of a financial calendar rather. Then you've got to also define additional subledger accounting methods such as standard accrual or cash, and that is defined in subledger accounting module. So when defining ledgers in Accounting Setup Manager, you assign the subledger accounting method if planning to use subledger accounting to integrate data from the transactional sources, which could include your subledgers such as account receivables or fixed assets or projects or service contracts and so on. You perform the step for each subledger accounting method. Accounting Setup Manager pages. So in the last two movies, I let you understand the process and the prerequisite steps that you've got to follow. I've also taken you through the Accounting Setup Manager briefly. Now I'm going to take you through the forms for all the prerequisite steps, including the one that you've got to do in Accounting Setup Manager. So I'm going to go to Oracle Applications and start by going to the General Ledger Responsibility, take you through the other related setups. Okay, so having said that, I'm going to go to the home, going back to General Ledger Vision Operations USA Responsibility, and the navigation would be Setup, and then you've got to go to Financials and then look for Flex Fields here, and then Key, and then Segments. So it's going to open a Java based form. So accept the defaults. Okay, here you simply query, and the first key flex field, which is titled as Accounting Flex Field, is the one you've got to create your structure. So for Vision Operations Ledger, the structure used is Operations Accounting Flex. Okay, and within that, if you go to Segments, you will see the segment definition over here. And within these segments, you've got to qualify the balancing segment, which is the first one in this case, a company one. So you go to Flex Field Qualifier, which is where you specify this segment is a balancing segment. Okay. Likewise, you've got to identify the cost center and national account segments. And once you have done that, you've got to also give the segment qualifiers for each of the segments. So this is the form for giving the segment qualifiers. And once that happens, you've got to attach the value sets. So unless you want to use new value sets, you can use the existing ones. But if you want to use the value sets which are not there in the system, you've got to create those value sets. So you go to value set window, and here you can create new value sets. Okay. Once you have created them, save them, and you can attach it over here. Then each of these value set may contain values, so you've got to populate the value set to contain the values. They are just like buckets. So you go there, and within this you query the value set, and you can see the values. So you want to define a new value, you can click new and add a new one, just like this. Okay, so that's the setup you've got to follow. Once you have done all these setup, then you come out and then you freeze the flex field definition, and then you compile it. So subject to the condition that there are no compilation errors, you're all set to use this structure in your accounting ledger. So the next step would be you've got to create the accounting combinations. So that would help you to ease your data entry. And once that gets over, then you've got to define the calendar. So where do you define the calendar? You can see the right beneath this one, you've got a calendar, and here you have a place to define the accounting calendar. So you click open, and that's the place you can define a new accounting calendar. Okay, so there are several which are already defined. Okay, it must be a fiscal calendar for your financial year. Okay, and then I'm gonna close this. The next step you've got to also consider is checking the currencies to make sure all the currencies have been defined. So usually the currencies comes along with the default instance, but in case you want to define one which is not existing, then you can define it in these forms, currencies, and then define. Go here and look for the currency that you would like to define, or for existing currency simply query it. And then if you're using foreign currencies as a part of your transaction, then you've got to define the rates associated with your base currency and the foreign currency, which can be defined in this form called as currency daily rates form. So you can see here, and if you create, you can create it via a form, or you can import it via a spreadsheet. So those are all the forms. I would say most of the forms which have been covered. So one thing that we haven't covered are the accounting methods in your ledger setup, which I believe I've shown you previously, but quickly. So you come back here to the navigator and navigate to the accounting setup manager, which will open a HTML based form. You can query an existing ledger, and here if you go to ledger options, you will have a place to give the subledger accounting method. So you've got to predefine it, and that is defined under Oracle subledger accounting module. There is a certain amount of setup that goes into defining an accounting method out there. Then you can use it over here. All right, so those are things or prerequisites you've got to do before you can proceed ahead and define and start working on the steps I have shown you over here. Accounting Setup Manager checklist. So far in the previous lessons, we understood the process, the prerequisite, and we have also seen the Accounting Setup Manager pages. Now I would like to show you the entire checklist for the setup steps that goes into setting up your accounting enterprise structures. So I'm going to minimize this, and I'm going to go directly on to Oracle documentation. So here I've opened it up. As you could see, Accounting Setup Manager. So the first step is you've got to define the legal entities. Legal entities are nothing but your company definition in Oracle Financials. Once you have defined the legal entities, then you've got to create your accounting setup structure, which consists of several sub-steps, including assigning the legal entities, defining the accounting representation, which includes creating and specifying the primary ledger and associating it with the legal entity, optionally specifying the ledger attributes in one or more secondary ledgers, and optionally assign one or more reporting currency. So we understood the concept of secondary ledgers and reporting currencies. Lastly, saving the accounting structure, and then proceed ahead to the next step, which is a required step of completing the ledger options. Once you have completed the ledger options, then the next step is conditionally required, which is for completing the reporting currencies. Then the optional step of assigning a balancing segment values to legal entities. I would say you must assign a balancing segment values to legal entities, although it's stated as optional, but I would say it is one of the mandatory steps. Similarly, you've got to assign a balancing segment value to a ledger, which is an optional step. Then the next step is conditionally required to define subledger accounting options. I would say it is a required option to specify the subledger accounting method and associated options. Then the next step is optional, which is to define the operating units if using accounting setup that has legal entities assigned. Then you define operating units for your primary ledger. So this is optional because operating units can be defined later, even after completing the ledger setup and legal entity setups. Similarly, the next step is optional for defining the intercompany accounts and defining the intercompany balancing rules. These steps can be done later as well. As I said, certain intercompany setups are there in other subledger modules, such as inventory. You can define more intercompany related options, and in other subledger modules. Then the next optional step is to define the sequencing. So you define accounting and reporting sequencing options for ledgers and reporting currencies in this setup step. You understood the forms and how to go about it, and you've got to repeat this step for each ledger that you define in your accounting structure. Then the next step is conditionally required because it is in relation to completing the primary to secondary ledger mapping. So if at all you have defined a secondary ledger, obviously you've got to map it to the primary ledger. Why it is conditionally required? Because there are times you may not define a secondary ledger at all, and hence this step will not be necessary. Then the next step is a required step to complete the accounting setup, which is after completing all the previous setups. So you review all your accounting setup, and if everything is okay, you complete it, which is where the system will save everything. Then the next step is optional setup, which is where you perform additional general ledger setup steps, which includes defining your ledger sets or data access sets. So ledger sets, as the name says, you can combine one or more ledger into a set. Likewise, data access sets means you can combine one or more data access sets in one data access set. So more about this I'm going to explain you in my General Ledger Functional Foundation course, how to go about defining the ledger sets and data access sets. Lastly, the required option is to assign profile options to responsibilities. So why it is required is once you have completed your accounting setup structure options and associated setups, then you've got to define new responsibilities, new users, and to those new responsibilities you've got to assign the legal entities and the ledgers that you have just defined, so that the transaction that happens within those responsibilities will be pointing to those legal entities and the ledgers that you have defined. So there are certain profile options that you have to update, and that is something I'm going to show you later on in my other course, General Ledger Functional Foundation. So these are all the 15 steps that you've got to do, which include certain optional and conditionally required steps as a part of your accounting setup manager checklist.